Maya stared at her old leather wallet, counting the crumpled bills for the third time. $5.67. That's all she had until her next paycheck, which wouldn't come for another 4 days. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm the butterflies dancing wildly in her stomach. The coffee shop where she worked mornings was already closed for the day. Maya had rushed home after her shift, showered quickly with the cheapest soap she could find, and put on her only decent dress. It was a simple black dress she'd bought at a thrift store 2 years ago. She'd washed and ironed it carefully, hoping it would look expensive enough for tonight. Her roommate Lisa had been the one to set up this blind date. Lisa meant well, but she didn't really understand Maya's situation. Lisa came from a family with money, while Maya had been taking care of her sick grandmother since she was 19. Every penny Maya earned went toward rent, groceries, and her grandmother's medicines. "Come on, Maya," Lisa had said last week while painting her nails bright pink. "You never go out. You work all the time. This guy seems really nice, and Romano's has amazing food. You deserve to have some fun." Maya had wanted to say no. She always said no to these things. But something in Lisa's voice made her agree. Maybe it was the way Lisa looked at her with pity, or maybe Maya was just tired of being alone all the time. Either way, she'd said yes, and now she was stuck. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror hanging on her bedroom wall. The dress fit well enough, and she'd managed to style her long black hair in a simple bun. Her grandmother had given her an old tube of lipstick, barely used, which added a touch of color to her pale face. She didn't look rich, but she looked presentable. The bus ride to Romano's took 25 minutes. Maya counted every stop, her anxiety growing with each passing block. She'd looked up the restaurant online, and her heart had sunk when she saw the prices. The cheapest item on the menu was a Caesar salad for $18. Even with the $5 in her wallet, she was nowhere close to affording a real meal. She'd practiced what she would say. Maybe she could tell her date she'd already eaten, or that she was on a special diet, or that she had a stomachache. Anything to avoid the embarrassment of not being able to pay for dinner. When the bus stopped outside Romano's, Maya almost stayed in her seat. Through the large windows, she could see couples laughing over wine and fancy pasta dishes. Everyone looked so comfortable, so wealthy. She felt like she was about to walk into a world where she didn't belong. But she forced herself to stand up and walk through the heavy wooden doors. The hostess was a tall woman with perfect makeup and an expensive-looking black dress. She looked Maya up and down with a slight frown, as if trying to figure out whether Maya was in the right place. "Good evening," the hostess said in a voice that wasn't exactly unfriendly, but wasn't warm either. "Do you have a reservation?" "Yes," Maya said quietly. "I'm meeting someone." "The reservation should be under Brad Wilson." The hostess checked her computer and nodded. "Right this way." Maya followed her through the crowded restaurant, feeling self-conscious about her simple dress and worn shoes. The other customers were dressed in clothes that probably cost more than Maya made in a month. She tried to keep her head up and walk confidently, but inside she felt like running back to the bus stop. The hostess led her to a table near the center of the restaurant. It was a good table with a nice view, but Maya would have preferred something more private, somewhere she could hide if things went badly. "Your date hasn't arrived yet," the hostess said, placing 2 leather-bound menus on the table. "Can I start you with something to drink?" Maya's throat felt dry, but she knew she couldn't afford even a soda. "Just water, please. I'll wait for my date before ordering anything else." The hostess nodded and walked away, leaving Maya alone at the table. She picked up the menu and started reading, even though she already knew she could only afford the salad. The descriptions made her mouth water. Homemade pasta with truffle oil, grilled salmon with lemon butter, chicken parmesan with fresh mozzarella. Everything sounded delicious and expensive. She pulled out her phone and opened the calculator app, adding up different combinations of items to see if there was any way she could afford more than just a salad. But even the appetizers were $15 or more. Her $5 wouldn't even cover the tax on most items. At the table next to her, a man was sitting with a young girl who looked about 8 years old. The girl had curly brown hair and was coloring in a notebook, while the man helped her with what looked like homework. Maya couldn't help but notice how patient he was with the child, explaining math problems in a gentle voice and praising her when she got the answers right. The man looked like he was in his early 30s, with kind brown eyes and dark hair that was slightly messy, as if he'd been running his hands through it. He was wearing a nice suit, but he'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves. There was something approachable about him, unlike the other wealthy-looking customers in the restaurant. Maya found herself watching them interact. It reminded her of the evenings she spent with her grandmother, helping with crossword puzzles or watching old movies together. There was something comforting about seeing a parent and child having quiet, quality time together. The little girl looked up from her coloring and caught Maya watching them. Instead of looking away, the girl smiled and gave a little wave. Maya smiled back, feeling a bit of her nervousness fade away. 20 minutes passed, and there was still no sign of Brad. Maya had refilled her water glass 3 times and was starting to worry that she'd been stood up. She checked her phone again, but there were no messages. She was beginning to think about leaving when a man in an expensive gray suit rushed through the restaurant doors. He was tall and blonde, with the kind of confident walk that suggested he was used to being the most important person in any room. He looked around the restaurant with slight annoyance, as if the whole place wasn't quite up to his standards. Maya raised her hand slightly, and the man spotted her and walked over to the table. This had to be Brad. "Sorry I'm late," he said, not sounding particularly sorry. He sat down without pulling out Maya's chair or offering any real explanation for his delay. "Traffic was terrible, and I had to take an important call from a client." Maya smiled politely. "That's okay. I haven't been waiting long." Brad picked up his menu immediately, scanning the options with the confidence of someone who never had to worry about prices. Maya noticed he was wearing an expensive watch and shoes that probably cost more than she made in 3 months. "So," Brad said without looking up from his menu, "Lisa tells me you work at some coffee shop?" The way he said "some coffee shop" made it sound like the least important job in the world. Maya felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "Yes," she said quietly. "I work at Sunrise Cafe downtown. I also do tutoring in the evenings." "Tutoring," Brad repeated, still focused on his menu. "That's nice. Like a side hustle sort of thing?" Maya didn't know how to respond. For her, tutoring wasn't a side hustle. It was a necessity. She needed both jobs just to pay for basic expenses and help take care of her grandmother. The waiter appeared at their table, a friendly young man with a warm smile. "Good evening. Are you ready to order, or would you like a few more minutes?" Brad looked up from his menu for the first time since sitting down. "I'll have the filet mignon medium rare with the lobster tail, and bring me your best bottle of red." Fine. The waiter wrote down the order and turned to Maya. She felt her stomach drop as she realized Brad had just ordered a meal that probably cost over $100. "I'll just have the Caesar salad," Maya said quietly. "And water is fine for me." Brad raised an eyebrow. "That's all you're having? Come on, live a little. This place is supposed to have great pasta." Maya felt her face burning with embarrassment. She couldn't explain that she literally couldn't afford anything else without humiliating herself completely. "I'm not very hungry," she lied. "I had a late lunch." The truth was she'd had a piece of toast for breakfast and nothing since then, saving her money for this dinner that she still couldn't really afford. As the waiter walked away, Maya caught the eye of the man at the next table. He was still helping his daughter with her homework, but she could tell he'd overheard their conversation. There was something in his expression that looked almost concerned, but he quickly looked away when their eyes met. Maya wondered what he was thinking. Could he tell that she was completely out of place here? Did he feel sorry for her? She tried to focus on Brad, who was now talking about his job in real estate and how much money he'd made on his last commission. But her mind kept wandering to her wallet with its $5 and how she was going to explain to her grandmother why she'd spent money they didn't have on a salad she didn't even want. Brad continued talking about his job, his voice getting louder with each story. Maya noticed other diners glancing over at their table, and she wished she could disappear into her chair. He was telling her about a house he'd sold for $2 million, gesturing wildly with his hands and acting like he was the smartest person who'd ever lived. "The clients were so impressed with my negotiation skills," Brad said, leaning back in his chair with a smug smile. "They told me I was the best realtor they'd ever worked with. Of course, that's what most people say about me." Maya nodded politely, but she couldn't help thinking about how different this was from what she'd hoped for. She'd imagined having a real conversation with someone, maybe learning about each other's dreams and interests. Instead, Brad seemed only interested in talking about himself. The waiter returned with Brad's expensive wine. He went through the whole tasting process, swirling the wine in his glass and making a big show of smelling it, before nodding his approval. Maya had never seen anyone act like this in real life. It seemed so unnecessary. "Are you sure you don't want a glass?" Brad asked, but he was already pouring himself a generous serving. "This is a really good vintage. Probably costs more than most people make in a day." Maya shook her head. Even if she wanted wine, which she didn't particularly, she knew she couldn't afford it. And the way Brad talked about money made her uncomfortable. He seemed to think that expensive meant better, and that everyone should be impressed by how much he could spend. At the table next to them, the little girl was showing her father a drawing she'd made. Maya could hear their quiet conversation and couldn't help comparing it to the loud, one-sided discussion she was having with Brad. "That's beautiful, Sophie," the man said to his daughter. "Is that supposed to be our house?" "Yes, but I made the garden bigger," the girl replied. "I want to plant flowers there when spring comes." "That sounds like a wonderful idea. We can pick out seeds together this weekend." Maya found herself smiling at their interaction. There was something so genuine about the way they talked to each other, so different from Brad's constant bragging. Their food arrived, and Maya's heart sank even further. Her Caesar salad looked tiny next to Brad's huge steak and lobster. The waiter set down Brad's plate with a flourish, and Maya could see that his meal probably cost more than she spent on groceries in a week. "Now this is what I call dinner," Brad announced loudly, cutting into his steak. "You really should have ordered something better, Maya. I mean, a salad? We're not at McDonald's." Maya felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Several people at nearby tables were now openly staring at them. She wanted to explain that she would love to have ordered something else, but the words stuck in her throat. "I told you." "I'm not very hungry," she said quietly, stabbing at a piece of lettuce with her fork. Brad shrugged and continued eating his expensive meal. "Your loss. This steak is perfect, probably the best I've ever had, and I eat at a lot of high-end places." As the meal continued, Brad's behavior got worse. He snapped his fingers at the waiter when his wine glass was empty, complained that the music was too loud, and made rude comments about other customers. Maya found herself apologizing to the staff on his behalf, which only seemed to annoy him. "You're too nice," Brad said after Maya had thanked their waiter for the third time. "These people are just doing their jobs. You don't need to act like they're your best friends." Maya disagreed completely. She'd worked in service jobs her whole life, and she knew how much a simple thank you could mean to someone who was working hard to make customers happy. But she didn't say anything because she could tell Brad wouldn't understand. The man at the next table was still helping his daughter with her homework. Maya noticed he was very patient, never getting frustrated even when the little girl struggled with a math problem. It reminded her of the tutoring work she did, and how rewarding it felt to help a child finally understand something difficult. "So tell me about your family," Brad said suddenly, as if he just remembered he was supposed to ask questions on a date. "What do your parents do?" Maya hesitated. This was always a difficult topic for her. "My parents died in a car accident when I was 17, she said softly. "I live with my grandmother now and I help take care of her." She expected Brad to show some sympathy, or at least acknowledge that this must have been hard for her. Instead, he just nodded and kept eating. "That's rough," he said with his mouth full. "But hey, at least you don't have to deal with family drama, right? My parents are always calling me, asking for money or wanting me to visit. It's such a pain." Maya stared at him in disbelief. She would give anything to have her parents call her, even if it was just to ask for help. She missed them every single day, and here was Brad complaining about having a family that cared about him. "I miss them," Maya said quietly. "I'd love to hear from them again." Brad seemed to realize he'd said something wrong, but instead of apologizing, he changed the subject. "So what's your plan for the future? Are you going to work at that coffee place forever?" The question stung because Maya had dreams, but they seemed impossible with her current situation. "I'd like to go back to school someday," she said. "Maybe study social work. I want to help families who are going through difficult times." Brad actually laughed at her answer. "Social work? That's not exactly a career that pays well. You should think about getting into sales or something. I could probably help you get started in real estate. The money is amazing if you're good at it." Maya felt anger rising in her chest. Brad had no idea what her life was like, yet he felt comfortable dismissing her dreams and telling her what she should do instead. She took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. "I think helping people is important," she said. Not everything is about money. Easy to say when you're young, Brad replied, waving his hand dismissively. Wait until you have real responsibilities. Then you'll understand why money matters. Maya bit back her response. Real responsibilities? She'd been taking care of herself and her grandmother for years, working 2 jobs and sacrificing everything for the people she loved. Brad had no idea what real responsibility looked like. Their conversation was interrupted when Brad's phone rang. He looked at the screen and his face lit up. Sorry, I have to take this, he said, already answering the call. This is Brad Wilson. Yes, I can talk now. He stood up from the table and walked a few steps away, but he was speaking loudly enough that everyone nearby could hear his conversation. It was clearly a business call, and he was trying to impress whoever was on the other end with his success and connections. Maya sat alone at the table, picking at her salad and trying not to cry. This was turning out to be even worse than she'd feared. Not only was she embarrassed about not being able to afford a real meal, but her date was rude, selfish, and completely uninterested in getting to know her as a person. She glanced over at the father and daughter at the next table. The little girl was now coloring again while her dad reviewed some papers, but he kept looking up to check on her and smile. Maya could tell they genuinely enjoyed each other's company. The man caught her looking and gave her a sympathetic smile. Maya quickly looked away, embarrassed to be caught staring. But there had been something kind in his expression, something that made her feel less alone in this terrible situation. Brad was still on his phone call, gesturing dramatically and speaking even louder than before. Maya could hear him talking about closing deals and making huge commissions. Other customers were starting to look annoyed by the noise he was making. Maya checked her phone and realized they'd been at the restaurant for over an hour. She'd barely touched her salad, but she'd lost her appetite completely. All she wanted was to go home to her small apartment and her grandmother's comforting presence. She thought about her grandmother, who was probably watching her favorite TV show and wondering how Maya's date was going. Her grandmother always worried about Maya working too much and not having enough fun. She'd been so excited when Maya had told her about the dinner date. You deserve to be happy, sweetheart, her grandmother had said. You've given up so much to take care of me. I want you to meet someone special. Maya wished she could tell her grandmother that she'd already met the most special person in her life. Her grandmother had been her rock through the hardest times, always believing in Maya's dreams even when they seemed impossible. Brad finally ended his phone call and returned to the table, looking pleased with himself. Sorry about that, he said, though he didn't sound sorry at all. Big deal coming through. Might be worth $500,000 in commission. Maya nodded politely, but she was already planning her escape. She would finish her salad, make an excuse about feeling sick, and get out of this restaurant as quickly as possible. But as Brad sat down and started talking about his phone call, Maya realized her night was about to get even worse. When Brad sat back down, he was even more energetic than before. His phone call had clearly gone well, and he seemed to think this gave him the right to be even more obnoxious than he'd already been. That was my biggest client, he announced loudly, cutting into his steak again. They want me to handle 3 more properties for them. I'm probably going to make more money this month than most people make all year. Maya forced herself to smile and nod, but inside she was screaming. She'd never met anyone so obsessed with money and status. Every sentence that came out of Brad's mouth was about how successful he was, how much he earned, or how impressed other people were with him. You know what your problem is, Maya? Brad said, suddenly pointing his fork at her. You think too small. You're wasting your time with this tutoring and coffee shop stuff. You should be thinking bigger, like me. Maya felt her patience finally starting to crack. I don't think helping children learn is thinking small, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Education is important. Brad laughed that same dismissive laugh that made Maya's skin crawl. Sure, education is important, but you're not changing the world by teaching some kid how to do math. You're just barely getting by. Where's the ambition? At the table next to them, David was still helping Sophie with her homework, but Maya could tell he was listening to their conversation. His jaw looked tense and he kept glancing over with a concerned expression. I have plenty of ambition, Maya said, her voice getting a little stronger. I want to help families who are struggling. I want to make a difference in people's lives. Making a difference doesn't pay the bills, Brad replied, taking a large gulp of wine. Trust me, I used to think like you when I was younger. Then I grew up and realized that nice ideas don't put food on the table. Maya wanted to tell him that she knew more about putting food on the table than he ever would. She wanted to explain that she'd been supporting herself and her grandmother for years, making impossible choices between medicine and groceries, heat and rent. But she knew Brad wouldn't understand. He'd probably just see it as proof that she was doing something wrong. The waiter came by to check on them, and Brad immediately started complaining about the service. "This bread basket has been empty for 10 minutes, he said rudely. "And I asked for my steak to be medium rare, but this is more like medium." Maya looked at Brad's steak, which looked perfectly cooked to her. The waiter apologized politely and offered to have the chef prepare a new one, but Brad waved him away with annoyance. "Just forget it," Brad said. "But I'm definitely not paying full price for this meal." Maya felt mortified. The waiter had been nothing but kind and professional, and now he was being treated like he'd done something terrible. She caught the waiter's eye and mouthed, "Sorry," when Brad wasn't looking. "You're too nice to the help," Brad said once the waiter had left. "These people expect you to complain. It's how the business works. If you're not demanding, they'll walk all over you." Maya had worked enough service jobs to know that wasn't true at all. The best customers were the ones who were patient and understanding, who treated servers like human beings instead of servants. But she didn't bother arguing with Brad anymore. David was now openly watching their table, and Maya could see the disapproval in his eyes. She felt embarrassed that this stranger was witnessing her humiliation, but she also felt grateful that at least someone seemed to understand how awful Brad was being. Sophie looked up from her coloring book and whispered something to her father. He nodded and whispered back, and Maya saw the little girl look over at their table with sad eyes. "The thing about women," Brad continued, apparently feeling like he needed to share more of his wisdom, "is that they don't understand how the real world works. They get caught up in all this emotional stuff instead of focusing on what actually matters." Maya stared at him in disbelief. "What exactly do you think actually matters?" "Success, money, status, making something of yourself instead of just getting by." Brad gestured around the expensive restaurant. "Look at this place. Do you think the owner got here by tutoring kids and making coffee? No way. He took risks, made smart investments, built something real." Maya felt her anger finally boiling over. "And what about the people who work here? The servers, the cooks, the people who make this place run? Do their jobs not matter?" Brad shrugged. "They're stepping stones. Everyone has to start somewhere, but the smart ones don't stay there." That was it. Maya had heard enough. She was about to tell Brad exactly what she thought of his attitudes when his phone rang again. "Hold that thought," he said, already reaching for his phone. "This might be important." He answered the call and immediately stood up, walking away from the table again. Maya could hear him talking loudly about square footage and property values, trying to impress whoever was on the other end. Maya sat alone again, staring at her half-eaten salad and wondering how she'd ended up in this nightmare. She glanced around the restaurant, looking at all the happy couples sharing intimate conversations and romantic dinners. She felt like she was watching a movie about a life she'd never have. That's when David stood up from his table. Maya watched as he said something quietly to Sophie, who nodded and went back to her coloring. Then he walked over to Maya's table with a gentle smile on his face. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I hope you don't mind me interrupting, but I think we've met before." Maya looked up at him confused. She was sure she'd never seen this man before in her life, but there was something familiar about his kind eyes. "I'm David," he continued, extending his hand. "My daughter Sophie and I were just talking, and she thinks you might be the tutor who helped her with reading a couple of years ago." "Sophie Rodriguez from Maple Elementary?" Maya's eyes widened as she looked over at the little girl, who was now smiling and waving at her. Suddenly it all came back to her. Sophie had been one of her tutoring students during her first year doing educational support. She'd been a shy, struggling reader who'd blossomed with a little extra attention and encouragement. "Sophie," Maya exclaimed, genuinely happy for the first time all evening. "I can't believe how much you've grown. You look wonderful." Sophie beamed and ran over to their table, throwing her arms around Maya in an enthusiastic hug. "I remember you. You're the nice teacher who helped me learn to read chapter books." Maya hugged the little girl back, feeling tears prick at her eyes. She remembered Sophie as a quiet, insecure child who'd been convinced she wasn't smart enough to keep up with her classmates. Seeing her now, confident and happy, reminded Maya why she loved working with children. "How's school going?" Maya asked Sophie. "Are you still reading lots of books?" "I read 3 books last week," Sophie said proudly. Daddy says I'm reading at a high school level now. David smiled warmly. She's become quite the bookworm. We have to limit her reading time or she'd stay up all night with a flashlight under the covers. Maya laughed, remembering her own childhood reading habits. That's the best kind of problem to have. Brad was still on his phone call, gesturing wildly and speaking loud enough that other customers were starting to look annoyed. Maya glanced over at him and felt a wave of embarrassment wash over her again. David seemed to notice her discomfort. "Is everything all right?" he asked gently. "You look like you're not having a very good evening." Maya didn't know how to answer. She couldn't exactly explain that her date was a complete disaster and she couldn't afford to be at this restaurant in the first place. "It's complicated," she said, quietly. That's when Brad finally ended his call and came back to the table. He looked irritated to find David and Sophie there, as if they were intruding on his territory. "Can I help you?" Brad asked rudely, not bothering to hide his annoyance. David remained calm and polite. "I was just saying hello to Maya. My daughter Sophie used to be one of her tutoring students." "Great," Brad said sarcastically. "Well, we're trying to have dinner here, so if you could give us some privacy." Maya felt mortified by Brad's rudeness, but David didn't seem fazed. If anything, his expression grew more disapproving as he took in Brad's attitude. "Of course," David said pleasantly. "I just wanted to thank Maya again for all her help with Sophie's reading. She made such a difference in my daughter's confidence and love of learning." Maya felt a warmth spread through her chest. It meant so much to hear that her work had mattered, especially after listening to Brad dismiss everything she cared about. Maya was the best tutor ever, Sophie chimed in. "She made reading fun and she always believed I could do it even when I didn't believe in myself." Brad rolled his eyes. "That's nice. Can we get back to our dinner now?" David's friendly expression finally shifted and Maya could see a flash of steel in his eyes. "I'm sorry I didn't catch your name," he said to Brad. "Brad Wilson," Brad replied, puffing up his chest. "I'm in real estate. High-end properties, commercial development, that sort of thing." "Interesting," David said thoughtfully. "And what company do you work for?" "I'm with Metropolitan Properties," Brad said proudly. "Maybe you've heard of us. We handle some of the biggest deals in the city." David nodded slowly. "I have heard of Metropolitan Properties, actually. Didn't you guys try to get a meeting with Hartwell Tech last year? Something about wanting to handle our new headquarters project?" Brad's expression changed completely. The silence at the table was deafening. Maya watched as Brad's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and then pure panic. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. David stood calmly beside the table, his hand resting gently on Sophie's shoulder. There was no smugness in his expression, no satisfaction at catching Brad in his rudeness. He simply waited, giving Brad a chance to respond. "Mr. Harrison," Brad finally managed to stammer, his voice completely different from the confident tone he'd been using all evening. I had no idea. I didn't realize that you were being incredibly rude to someone who clearly didn't deserve it," David asked quietly. His voice was still polite, but there was an edge to it that made Maya's heart race. Brad's face turned red, and Maya could see sweat forming on his forehead. The transformation was remarkable. Just minutes ago, he'd been loud and arrogant, treating everyone around him like they were beneath him. Now he looked like a scared child who'd been caught doing something wrong. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Brad said, his voice shaking slightly. "I wasn't being rude. Maya and I were just having a conversation. A conversation where you dismissed her career goals, insulted her life choices, and treated the restaurant staff like servants?" David asked calmly. "Because that's what I heard from my table." Maya felt her cheeks burning. She was mortified that David and Sophie had witnessed her humiliation, but she was also amazed at how David was handling the situation. He wasn't yelling or making a scene. He was simply stating facts in a calm, controlled voice that was somehow more powerful than any angry outburst could have been. Sophie tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, can Maya come sit with us?" She looked sad. The innocence of the question hit Maya right in the heart. This little girl, who barely knew her, could see that she was unhappy and wanted to help. It was such a contrast to Brad, who had spent the entire evening making her feel worse about herself. "That's a wonderful idea, Sophie," David said, smiling down at his daughter. "What do you say, Maya? Would you like to join us for the rest of dinner? I think you might find our conversation more pleasant. Maya looked between David and Brad, unsure of what to do. Part of her wanted to run away from this entire situation. Another part of her wanted to accept David's kind invitation and leave Brad sitting alone at this expensive table with his overpriced meal and his wounded pride. I don't want to impose, Maya said quietly. You wouldn't be imposing at all, David assured her. Sophie would love the company, and honestly, so would I. It's not often we meet someone from Sophie's past who made such a positive impact on her life. Brad suddenly came alive again, as if he'd been calculating his next move. Now wait just a minute, he said, his voice getting louder. Maya is my date. We came here together and we're having a perfectly fine evening. Maya stared at him in disbelief. A perfectly fine evening? After everything he'd said and done, he actually thought things were going well? Are you having a fine evening, Maya? David asked gently, looking directly at her with those kind brown eyes. The question hung in the air. Maya could feel the attention of nearby tables, could see the hope in Sophie's face, could sense the tension radiating from Brad. This was her moment to speak up for herself, to stop pretending that everything was okay when it clearly wasn't. No, she said quietly, her voice growing stronger with each word. No, I'm not having a fine evening at all. Brad's face went through another series of expressions. Maya, come on. Don't be dramatic. We're just getting to know each other. Getting to know each other? Maya repeated, finally finding her voice. You've spent this entire dinner talking about yourself. You've made fun of my job, dismissed my dreams, and been rude to every person who's tried to serve us. You haven't asked me a single meaningful question about my life. I asked about your family, Brad protested weakly. You asked. And when I told you my parents were dead, you said I was lucky not to have family drama. Maya shot back. That's not getting to know someone. That's just being cruel. Sophie's eyes widened at Maya's words, and David's expression grew even more serious. Maya immediately regretted speaking so harshly in front of the little girl, but the words had been building up inside her all evening. I'm sorry, Sophie, Maya said quickly. I didn't mean to raise my voice. It's okay, Sophie said seriously. Sometimes grown-ups need to use their strong voices when other grown-ups are being mean. David squeezed his daughter's hand proudly. That's exactly right, sweetheart. Brad was looking around the restaurant nervously, clearly aware that other customers were watching the drama unfold. Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot, he said, trying to regain control of the situation. Why don't we start over? I'll order us another bottle of wine and we can talk about something else. I don't drink, Maya said firmly, and I don't think starting over is going to fix the problem. What problem? Brad asked, his voice getting defensive again. I've been nothing but generous tonight. I brought you to a nice restaurant, ordered expensive food. You ordered expensive food for yourself, Maya corrected, and then you made me feel terrible for not being able to afford the same thing. The truth was out now, hanging between them like a wall. Maya had admitted what she'd been trying to hide all evening, that she couldn't afford to eat at this restaurant, that she was completely out of her depth in this world of expensive wines and $100 steaks. David's expression softened even more, and Maya saw understanding flash in his eyes. Maya, he said gently, would you please join Sophie and me? I promise we're much better company. Before Maya could answer, Brad stood up abruptly. Fine, he said loudly, loud enough that half the restaurant could hear him. If you want to embarrass yourself by running off with strangers, go ahead. But don't expect me to pay for your meal. The words hit Maya like a slap. She'd been afraid of this moment all evening. The moment when she'd have to face the fact that she couldn't pay for even her simple salad. Her $5 wouldn't even cover the tax. That's not a problem, David said calmly, pulling out his wallet. I'll take care of Maya's meal. No, Maya said quickly, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. I can't let you do that. I don't want charity. David paused, his wallet halfway out of his pocket. It's not charity, Maya. It's what decent people do when they see someone being treated badly. Brad laughed nastily. Decent people? You don't even know her. She's just some girl who makes coffee and babysits kids. What makes you think she's worth helping? The question hung in the air, and Maya felt her eyes filling with tears. This was her worst fear realized, being judged as worthless because of her job, her circumstances, her inability to afford nice things. David's calm expression finally cracked, and Maya saw real anger flash in his eyes. What makes her worth helping? He repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. Let me tell you what I see when I look at Maya. He turned to face Maya directly, his voice becoming warmer but still loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. I see someone who worked with my daughter when Sophie was struggling and scared. Someone who was patient enough to help a shy little girl learn to love reading. Someone who's been taking care of her sick grandmother while working multiple jobs and still finding time to help other people's children succeed. Maya felt tears starting to roll down her cheeks. She'd never had anyone describe her life that way before, like it mattered, like she was doing something important. David turned back to Brad, his voice becoming stern again. I see someone who's been sitting here all evening listening to you insult her dreams and make her feel small, and she's been too polite to tell you what she really thinks. I see someone with more grace and dignity in her little finger than you have in your entire body. The restaurant had gone quiet around them. Maya could feel dozens of eyes watching the confrontation, but for once she didn't feel embarrassed. She felt defended, protected, valued. Brad's face was bright red now. You don't know anything about me or my success, and I know enough, David said calmly. I know that my company rejected your proposal because your team was rude to our receptionist and made our janitor feel uncomfortable. We don't do business with people who treat others badly, regardless of how successful they claim to be. Sophie had been watching the entire exchange with wide eyes. Now she tugged on Maya's hand and whispered loudly, Maya, you can definitely sit with us. Daddy makes much better conversation than that mean man. Despite everything, Maya found herself laughing through her tears. Sophie's innocent honesty was exactly what she needed to hear. You know what, Sophie? Maya said, wiping her eyes. I think you're absolutely right. She stood up from Brad's table and walked over to sit with David and Sophie, leaving Brad standing alone beside his expensive meal, looking like a man who had just realized he'd made a very costly mistake. 3 months had passed since that unforgettable evening at Romano's, and Maya could hardly believe how much her life had changed. She woke up in her small apartment, but instead of the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach about money and bills, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Her new job at Community Care Foundation had started just 6 weeks ago. It wasn't the social work position she ultimately dreamed of, but it was a step in the right direction. She worked as a family support coordinator, helping connect struggling families with resources they needed: food assistance, housing support, educational programs, and healthcare services. The best part was that David hadn't just handed her the job. When he'd mentioned that his company supported local nonprofits and that one of them was looking for someone with her background, Maya had insisted on applying like any other candidate. She'd prepared for hours, researched the organization thoroughly, and gone through 3 rounds of interviews before getting the position. I earned this, she reminded herself every morning as she got ready for work. It wasn't charity or a favor from a wealthy man who felt sorry for her. It was a real job that she'd gotten based on her experience, her passion, and her qualifications. Her grandmother had been so proud when Maya told her about the new position. I always knew you were meant to help people, sweetheart, her grandmother had said, tears in her eyes. Your parents would be so proud of what you've become. Maya still lived in the same small apartment and still shopped carefully for groceries, but now she could afford her grandmother's medications without having to choose between heat and food. She could buy books instead of always borrowing them from the library. She could even save a little money each month, something she'd never been able to do before. But the biggest change in Maya's life wasn't the job or the financial security. It was the friendship that had grown between her. David and Sophie, that night at Romano's, after Brad had stormed out of the restaurant muttering about ungrateful people and wasted evenings. Maya had sat with David and Sophie for 2 hours. They'd talked about books, about Sophie's school projects, about Maya's dreams of becoming a social worker, and about David's struggles with balancing his demanding career and being a good father. It had been the kind of conversation Maya had hoped to have on her blind date, real, honest, and meaningful. David had listened when she talked about her grandmother, asking thoughtful questions and sharing stories about his own elderly mother who lived across the country. Sophie had shown Maya her latest drawings and asked for help with a difficult math problem, just like old times. When the evening ended, David had insisted on driving Maya home, not because he was trying to impress her or because he saw her as a charity case, but because it was late and he was a decent person who wouldn't let someone take the bus alone at night. Thank you, Maya had said as they sat in his car outside her apartment building. Not just for dinner, but for standing up for me. I don't think anyone's ever done that before. You shouldn't have to thank someone for treating you with basic respect, David had replied. That's just how people should behave. Over the following weeks, they'd stayed in touch. David would text her updates about Sophie's reading progress, and Maya would send pictures of interesting books she thought Sophie might like. When Sophie had a school project about community helpers, she'd asked if Maya could help her interview someone who worked with families in need. Slowly, carefully, a friendship had developed. Maya was grateful that David never made her feel rushed or pressured. He seemed to understand that after her experience with Brad, she needed time to trust that not all successful men were arrogant and self-centered. Now, 3 months later, Maya was getting ready for what had become a weekly tradition: Friday evening dinner with David and Sophie. Sometimes they cooked together at David's house. Sometimes they went out to family-friendly restaurants. And sometimes they ordered pizza and played board games. Maya had worried at first that she was imposing on their father-daughter time. But David had assured her that Sophie loved having her around, and he enjoyed the company too. "Sophie lights up when you're here," he'd told Maya, "and honestly, so do I." Tonight was special because they were celebrating Maya's acceptance into the graduate social work program at the local university. She'd applied with David's encouragement, and when the acceptance letter had arrived 2 days ago, he and Sophie had been the first people she'd called. Maya looked at herself in the mirror as she got ready. She was wearing the same black dress she'd worn to that disastrous blind date, but somehow it looked different now. She looked different. There was a confidence in her posture, a brightness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. "Maya, Daddy is making your favorite pasta tonight, and I made you a surprise." Maya smiled as she read the message. Sophie had become like a little sister to her, and Maya treasured their relationship. She'd continued tutoring Sophie informally, but now it felt more like homework time between family members than a professional arrangement. When Maya arrived at David's house, a comfortable, warmly decorated home that felt nothing like the cold, expensive spaces she'd imagined wealthy people lived in, Sophie ran to greet her at the door. "Maya, look what I made for you." Sophie held up a hand-drawn card with "Congratulations, graduate student," written in careful letters decorated with hearts and stars. "Oh, Sophie, this is beautiful," Maya said, kneeling down to hug the little girl. "I'm going to put this on my refrigerator at home." David appeared from the kitchen wearing an apron that said, "World's okayest cook," a gift from Sophie. "There's the future social worker," he said with a warm smile. "How does it feel to be officially accepted?" "Terrifying and exciting at the same time," Maya admitted. "I keep thinking about all the families I'll be able to help once I have my degree." "You're already helping families," David pointed out. "The degree will just make it official." Over dinner, they talked about Maya's plans for graduate school, Sophie's upcoming school play, and David's latest project at work. The conversation flowed naturally, comfortably, like they'd been having family dinners together for years instead of months. "Maya," Sophie said suddenly, "are you going to be too busy for us when you're in college?" The question caught Maya off guard. She looked at the little girl's worried face and felt her heart squeeze. "Oh, sweetheart, I'll never be too busy for you and your daddy. School might keep me busier, but you two are important to me. We'll always make time for each other." David reached across the table and squeezed Maya's hand. "We'll help however we can," he said. "Study sessions, babysitting duty, whatever you need." Maya felt tears prick at her eyes. After years of struggling alone, having people who wanted to support her dreams felt almost overwhelming. "I don't know how to thank you both for everything you've done for me." "You don't need to thank us," David said gently. "This is what people do when they care about each other." After dinner, while Sophie worked on a puzzle, David and Maya sat on the porch swing in his backyard. The evening was warm, and Maya could hear the sounds of other families in the neighborhood. Children playing, dogs barking, the distant sound of someone grilling dinner. "Can I ask you something?" David said quietly. "Of course. That night at Romano's when you said you only had $5, were you exaggerating?" Maya shook her head. "I had exactly $5.67. I was hoping I could just order something small and maybe Brad wouldn't notice." David was quiet for a moment. "I can't imagine how hard that must have been. And the way he treated you." "You know what's funny?" Maya said. I was so embarrassed that night, so ashamed of not having money. But now I realize that my financial situation said nothing about my worth as a person. Brad's behavior said everything about his character. That's exactly right, David agreed. Success isn't about how much money you have or how expensive your clothes are. It's about how you treat people, especially when you have nothing to gain from being kind to them. Maya thought about all the people who had shown her kindness over the years. Her grandmother, the teachers who had encouraged her, the families she'd tutored who had become like extended family, her coworkers at the coffee shop who had covered shifts when she was sick. I used to think I wanted to be rich, Maya said, but now I think I just want to be comfortable enough to help other people the way you've helped me. You've been helping people your whole life, David pointed out. Long before you had any money to spare. As the evening wound down and it was time for Maya to go home, Sophie ran up to her with another surprise, a bookmark she'd made with Maya's name on it. For all the books you'll need to read in graduate school, Sophie explained seriously. Maya hugged her tight. It's perfect. Thank you, sweetheart. As David walked her to his car to drive her home, he still insisted on driving her, even though she could afford taxi fare now. Maya reflected on how different her life had become. She thought about Brad sometimes, wondering if he'd learned anything from that night at Romano's. Probably not, she figured. Some people were too wrapped up in their own importance to see how they affected others, but she preferred to think about the lessons she'd learned.